Good afternoon, everybody. From knowledge and intellectual contribution, we'll talk a little bit about health and obesity. And basically, what I'm going to be presenting today is how the lifestyle and how basically the day-to-day behaviors of Generation Z is making them more vulnerable, more prone to become obese. So before we talk about their lifestyle, who are Generation Z? And if you look at the internet, there are many different sort of namings for Generation Z. And even if you look at the spectrum to when Generation Z are born, there's also different years. But I would say the majority would agree that they're basically the young adults, the kids, the adolescents these days that are born between 1995 and 2015. And Generation Z, what's basically special about them is they were brought up with the internet, with technology. They started using the internet at a very young age. And they are very comfortable with technology, like their smartphones, their iPads, computers, etc. And they're also very comfortable with social media, different social media platforms. So how is that making them more vulnerable to become obese? Well, actually, because they're spending basically long hours on their smartphones and their handheld devices, so they have high levels of screen time or sedentary behavior, which in turn affects their physical activity levels. So they're having lower physical activity levels. And they're also consuming basically a lot of sugary and fatty foods, hence the fast food. For example, my parents used to say, you are basically like the hamburger generation, into عيال الهامبرجر اللي كلها تاكلون fast food. So all of these factors are basically, or the chicken nuggets, yes. But the chicken nuggets are different. They don't eat chicken nuggets, but yeah. But we are also called the chicken nuggets. So how has that is all basically have put them at higher risk to becoming obese. And you all know that obesity has now reached epidemic proportion worldwide. It's basically a big problem. And the problem does not just stop at obesity, but all the associated diseases, all the risk factors, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, even certain types of cancer. And of course, all the economic tension it puts on our health system to treat obesity and all the other, again, associated diseases. So there is a problem, because obesity just keeps rising. And especially in our region, especially in the GCC region, it's got the highest obesity rates in the world, including Bahrain. And if we look at, well, across, but as individuals, as kids and adolescents, they are basically the fattest they've ever been. So for this specific age group. And if you look at research in the region, and specifically in Bahrain, there are less studies basically looking at risk factors, looking at lifestyle behaviors that are basically making adolescents, young adults, kids these days more prone to becoming obese. So what I did was I conducted a study that basically aims to investigate and understand how and whether or not the lifestyle behaviors of this generation is making them more prone to become obese. And what I did was I collected data from 6 different schools in the Kingdom of Bahrain. The sample size was approximately 1,000. It was 900 plus. And their ages ranged between 10 and 18. So basically kids and adolescents born between 1998 to 2008, plus minus. And what I found is quite disturbing, actually. And I come across this finding even in my previous sample, which I've used for my PhD. But what I find is that 1 in 3 of the participants was either overweight or obese. So meaning around 1/3 of the sample was either overweight or obese. I also find that the percentages for this specific age group there are twice as high when it comes to obesity and overweight among boys than it's among girls. So the problem is worse when it comes to boys in this specific age. And when I look at basically their lifestyle behaviors, their daily lifestyle behaviors, so if I look at their diet, I find that the majority, around 60%, are skipping breakfast regularly. I find that around 84% are eating fast food regularly, meaning more than 3 times a week. I also find that around 85% are not consuming sufficient amounts of fruit and vegetables. And when I say sufficient, we define it as 5 servings a day, 5 a day. So around 85% are not getting their 5 a day. Instead, 90% of them are consuming calorie-dense snacks, meaning chocolates, crisps, biscuits, on a daily basis. So they're eating way too much chips and chocolate, and they're not eating fruits and vegetables. They're skipping breakfast, they're having fast food. And although the reasons are not within the scope of the study, but if you look at other studies, the argument is that with Generation Z, in most households, both parents are working. So mothers may not have enough time to prepare their kids' meal because of convenience. Again, they may be relying more on fast food, etc. I don't know if that's the case in the sample, but it definitely requires some more research. When it comes to physical activity, again, I find approximately 80% of them physically inactive. And how do I define being sufficiently active? It's basically that they get an hour a day of physical activity, meaning they either run in the playground or they go play soccer, basketball, etc. So kids are supposed to get an hour a day of physical activity for them to be considered sufficiently active. Running around, playing, whether they play in sports, because we say moderate to vigorous physical activity. So the moderate is more maybe fast walking, running. Vigorous is more like training or, heavy weights or biking. Football is considered vigorous. Yeah, so it's part of it. It's part, but only 20% are considered physically active. The 80% are basically not considered physically active, and the percentages are far worse with the girls. So girls are actually less active in the sample. And again, even though it's not within the scope of the study, but if you look at other regional studies, they link it to sociocultural factors on how basically boys have more freedom to go out to maybe play soccer, play basketball, whereas girls are maybe under more pressure to stay at home or don't have the same freedom as boys are. Although things are changing, but still, that is still valid. When it comes to screen time, and with screen time, it's basically time they spend on whether it's TV, computers, smartphones, iPads. The recommendations is that they get 2 hours maximum of screen time. But when you look at the sample, the average was 4.3 hours, so it's more than twice. And around 80% being high sedentary, meaning around 80% of the sample are spending more than the recommended 2 hours. In fact, if you look at, there were some outliers that some of the participants were spending 16 hours a day on their smartphones. I don't know how is that possible with them going to school and sleeping and all of that. So again, also I found that girls were more sedentary. They were spending more time than boys. Maybe again, because boys have more freedom, they're going out, they're exercising. And what do girls do when they sit at home? They're playing with their phones. So they're not doing anything basically to benefit them. Okay, so if you're spending 16 hours a day on your phone, you have 24 hours a day. So what is that affecting? It's affecting their sleep. So they're sleeping less. And adults need a minimum of 7 to 8 hours of sleep in order for them to get sufficient sleep and not be sleep deprived. With kids and adolescents, they actually need more time. But I still classified it as 8 hours, and I still get around only 44% of the sample are getting the 8 hours. Again, because they're spending most of their time, on their smartphones, handheld devices, etc. And I find that the percentage of sleep-deprived boys is actually substantially higher than the percentage of girls. Because, again, the boys are going out to exercise more. The girls are sitting on their phones. So when they come back home, they are still using their phone, but instead of sleeping. So it kind of all makes sense. So where do the findings of this sample stand in terms of, like, globally? So, it's not a surprise. Globally, unhealthy dietary behaviors, basically low levels of physical activity, high screen time. It's a global problem among the adolescents and the kids these days, among the Generation Z. And if we look at studies from the UK, you look at studies from Australia, you look at studies from the US, you get similar findings with slight variation in the percentages. And if you look at other studies regionally also, in the GCC and the Arab world, findings are not that different. So there is a problem, and there is basically an urgent need for policymakers to address it. So in the Arab Gulf region, very few studies actually offer recommendations that translate basically research findings into practice. In Bahrain specifically, currently there are no programs directed at combating the obesity problem. And there is really a need for policymakers to address these risk factors and to basically start thinking of how to fight obesity from a young age. Because if they're used to it when they're young, if kids are aware of what's healthy and what's not, if kids are aware that they should be, exercising more, that they should be not eating this type of food and eating that type of food, that will save them a lifelong of struggle and suffering with obesity and hypertension and blood pressure and all these associated diseases. So, if this problem gets sort of addressed at an early age, really, you are going to save them from a lifelong of struggles. So that's it, I think, for me.
Thank you, Dr.